In September 2005, the ground in northern Ethiopia began to tear open. Across a roughly 60-kilometer stretch of the Afar Depression, earthquake shook the desert, a volcanic eruption broke through the surface, and satellite measurements showed parts of the rift opening by as much as 8 meters. Most of that movement did not come from a single fault slipping. Magma had pushed sideways through the crust. For geologists, it was an extraordinary event, a process normally associated with ocean floors unfolding on land. Yet Afar is only one piece of Ethiopia. Travel west and the land climbs into cool highlands cut by enormous gorges. Ancient churches are carved into rock. Rare animals survive on isolated plateaus. How can one country contain all of this? The answer begins deep below the surface, in a landscape that has been rising, cracking, eroding, and erupting for millions of years. From above, Ethiopia does not read like a flat map. It reads like relief. Large parts of the north and center stand high above the surrounding lowlands. The Ethiopian highlands rise to more than 4,000 meters in places, while parts of the Afar Depression lie below sea level. That difference in height changes almost everything: temperature, rainfall, vegetation, farming, movement, and where people can live. Ethiopia now has well over 130 million people, but they do not occupy one uniform environment. Highland communities may depend on rain-fed crops and dense networks of towns and roads. In lower and drier regions, pastoralism, mobility, and access to water become more important. Running through the country is the main Ethiopian rift, part of the East African Rift system. Farther north, in Afar, the tectonic picture becomes even more dramatic. The Nubian and Somalian plates are pulling apart, while the Arabian plate is also moving away across the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden systems. Afar sits near the meeting zone of these spreading boundaries. The movement is slow on a human timescale. Its effects are not. That vertical geography also changes travel. A settlement that appears close on a map may be separated from another by a gorge, an escarpment, or a road that must descend hundreds of meters before climbing again. In some areas, distance is measured less by kilometers than by how difficult the terrain is to cross. The Afar Depression strips geology down to something almost physical. Black lava fields spread across pale salt flats. Hot springs, fumaroles, and volcanic cones appear across a basin formed by extension of the crust. Near the Erta Ale volcanic range, magma has repeatedly reached the surface. Erta Ale itself has been known for decades of lava lake activity. Then, on November 23, 2025, nearby Haile Gubi erupted explosively. NASA described it as the volcano's first documented explosive eruption, sending ash and gas high into the atmosphere. That wording matters. It does not mean Hailey Gubby had never erupted before. Geological evidence shows that it had. It means no earlier explosive eruption had been directly documented in the modern record. People have lived and worked in this landscape for generations. Salt from the Afar lowlands has long been cut into blocks and carried toward highland markets. Camel caravans once dominated the trade. Trucks now handle more of it, but the old routes have not disappeared completely. The salt exists because the basin is low, dry, and intensely evaporative. The trade exists because lowland resources have value elsewhere. On the salt flats, the work itself is shaped by heat and distance. Blocks are cut from the crust, trimmed, stacked, and moved toward transport routes. What looks from the air like an empty mineral surface is, at ground level, part of an economic chain linking miners, traders, animals, trucks, and markets far above the depression. Even here, one of Ethiopia's harshest environments is tied to the highlands. But those highlands were not simply pushed up by the same event that opened Afar. Their story begins earlier. Around 30 million years ago, enormous volumes of basaltic lava erupted across what is now Ethiopia and Yemen. These flood basalts covered wide areas in layer after layer of volcanic rock. The region also underwent major uplift, although scientists still debate the exact timing and mechanisms. Later, rifting became more focused. Because Ethiopia's geography is not the product of one geological event. It is the result of events stacked on top of one another. The highlands create their own environmental rules. Air cools with elevation. Moisture arriving over raised terrain can produce heavy seasonal rain in some regions, while nearby lowlands remain far drier. For farmers, these differences are practical. Ethiopian agriculture is still predominantly rain-fed. The arrival, length, and reliability of rainy seasons can decide when fields are planted and what harvests are possible. Steep land adds another problem. Rain falling on exposed soil can carry that soil downhill. So the same elevation that helps create cooler, wetter farming zones also creates slopes that are difficult to protect. Across Ethiopia, people have spent centuries learning how to work within that trade-off. In the highlands, dependence on seasonal rain reaches into ordinary decisions. Geography here is not scenery in the background. It is part of the calendar. In the Konso highlands of southern Ethiopia, that knowledge is written across hillsides. Dry stone walls follow the contours of the land, turning steep slopes into terraces. They slow runoff, hold soil in place, collect water, and create narrow fields where farming would otherwise be far more difficult. Some of the walls reach several meters in height. They belong to a living system that requires maintenance, labor, and shared knowledge. Farther north, stone carries a different kind of memory. At Aksum, giant stelae and royal archaeological remains mark the center of a kingdom that became a major power in the first millennium CE. Its position in the northern highlands did not cut it off from the outside world. Trade routes linked the kingdom to the Red Sea port of Adulis, and from there to wider networks connecting Northeast Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean world. Centuries later, at Lalibela, builders worked downward instead of upward. 11 medieval churches were cut into rock, connected through a complex landscape of passages, trenches, and open spaces. The site remains a place of pilgrimage and worship. These places are very different. One is agricultural engineering. One reflects a trading kingdom. One is a sacred landscape. What connects them is not that geology determined Ethiopian culture. People took materials, roots, slopes, and limitations already present in the landscape and turned them into something useful or meaningful. The relationship becomes even clearer in Gedeo, along the eastern escarpment of Ethiopia's southern highlands. A farm here may not look like a conventional field. Tall trees form an upper canopy. Below them grow enset, coffee, shrubs, root crops, and other plants at different heights. UNESCO describes this as a multi-layer agroforestry system maintained through generations of local knowledge. Coffee gives this landscape a global connection. Wild and semi-wild coffee populations in Ethiopian forests are especially valuable because they preserve genetic diversity within the species. For the people growing food here, however, the system is not simply a story about a famous export. Enset is a major food crop. Coffee can provide cash income. Trees provide shade and structure. This is what adaptation often looks like in Ethiopia, arranging life around what the landscape can support. That brings us to the resource that connects the highlands to countries far beyond Ethiopia. In northwestern Ethiopia, Lake Tana sits high on the plateau. From it flows the Blue Nile. In the Simien Mountains, erosion has carved the plateau into deep valleys and cliffs that can fall around 1,500 meters. The broken terrain supports species with remarkably restricted ranges. Walia ibex are found only in the Simien Mountains. Geladas and Ethiopian wolves are also endemic to the Ethiopian highlands. Farther southeast, the Bale Mountains rise into another high-altitude world. Above 3,500 meters, the Senedi Plateau and surrounding slopes contain what UNESCO describes as the world's largest intact and contiguous expanse of Afro-alpine habitat. Then, the land drops into the moist Harena forest. Within a relatively short distance, cold open plateau gives way to dense forest where wild coffee grows. Elevation has divided habitats so sharply that isolation itself became part of the evolutionary story. Return to the Afar region, but move west of the active volcanic center toward the Awash Valley. Here the ground does something remarkable. It preserves time. At Hadar in 1974, researchers recovered 52 fragments of a partial skeleton that became famous worldwide. What makes the landscape especially useful to researchers is the surrounding geology. What the changing landscape did was preserve and reveal parts of humanity's record. The same region where scientists watched the crust rupture in 2005 also contains geological layers recording environments inhabited by distant human ancestors millions of years earlier. Afar is therefore both an active landscape and an archive. Ethiopia is often introduced through fragments. Volcanism built thick layers of rock. Uplift raised broad plateaus. Rivers cut those plateaus into gorges. Rifting opened low basins and volcanic corridors. Elevation shaped rainfall, farming, forests, wildlife, and movement. People answered those conditions with terraces, trade routes, agroforestry, pastoral systems, towns, and architecture. None of that means geography wrote Ethiopia's history in advance. Human choices, politics, faith, conflict, trade, and invention have always mattered. But the ground set the stage. And in Afar, that ground is still moving. The story of Ethiopia is not simply a country being pulled apart. It is a story of what can grow, endure, and connect across a landscape that has never stopped changing.